Well, the latest CBS News Battleground Tracker models show the GOP could take control of the House in November. Our survey and data analysis show right now that Republican turnout is expected to be higher than Democratic turnout, and that could give the right a slight majority and the power to block Democratic legislation in Congress. So Anthony Salvanto is here to break it all down for us. This data shows, to break down what the data shows, of course, he is CBS News' Executive Director of Elections and Surveys. Thanks for joining us. This is really interesting because there's been a lot of talk about whether some of the decisions that the Supreme Court has made, will that motivate one side or the other to get out and vote? And typically, you know, we're talking about midterm elections, not a presidential election, so fewer people typically vote. So just explain what's driving the numbers, Anthony.
Yeah, so good morning. Look, the first thing you want to remind everybody as we start this, about 100 days in, is that this is 435 separate elections going on. And in that, if you look at the Democratic seats, the Republican seats in Congress right now, most of these aren't going to move because of gerrymandering, because of partisanship. They're all going to stay put. So some big national trends can shift some of these seats. And if you go and talk to voters across all these districts like we did and model it, what you get is that number you read at the top, Anne-Marie, where these Republican seats would shift just a little bit over there. You know, in midterms, president's parties usually lose seats. This is just about a little under what the average loss is, up to 230. Okay, so that's where the lay of the land is now. Then if you go and actually answer your question, which is what do we think is driving this, and let's look at some of the big factors. I'm going to start with this because we've talked so much about the economy throughout this summer, especially. For those who say inflation is very important in their vote, which is a lot of people, they're breaking Republican. And some of that is Republicans just saying that because it's, you know, they're going to vote Republican anyway, and so they're going to answer that way. But at the same time, you get some voters who are on the fence for whom this is important, and that breaks them, and then that in turn breaks some of the seats.
So let's talk about turnout. What are we expecting?
Yeah. One of the things that's really interesting here is the way you get this differential turnout. And I'm going to scroll over to this slide because I think it illustrates a lot of what's going on. This is the partisanship that we see right now. It's not a party vote. It's what people think of themselves. And look at how Republicans are outpacing Democrats in likely voters. Well, that's not typical. That wasn't the case in 2020 and 2018 when the Democrats did better. So this tells you in a nutshell right now that Republicans are going to vote more, at least in terms of intent, at least right now.
Let me understand this, Anthony. So what this is basically saying is people who self-identify at this one in one party or another. Yeah. And in this polling, it shows that there are more people identifying as Republicans than there are Democrats.
Among likely voters. And that's the important part, right? We're talking about a midterm. We're talking maybe half the electorate will just sit this out and stay home. So much of the variance here is going to be whether or not people who don't always vote actually show up. And what you see from Republicans right now is they're kind of eager to go, right? This is 2020 again for them. It's another chance to vote. So you see that enthusiasm, you see that likelihood. This shifts the electorate to be older, to be less diverse, all of which are demographic characteristics that then favor the Republicans as well. Democrats have a harder time motivating that base, at least as of right now.
So you mentioned something that we already know, that usually during the midterm elections, the party in the White House loses some seats.
Yeah.
Let us talk about who's in the White House. Okay. President Biden, you know, who is he motivating or not motivating to come out and vote?
Yeah, so he's a bigger motivator for Republicans. And some of it refers to what I just said, where they feel like, okay, this is, you know, we get another shot at 2020. Frankly, a lot of them don't think Joe Biden won in 2020. So that's part of their motivation as well. We've seen that for months. But for Democrats, not necessarily, right? They're not necessarily out there in as large numbers for Joe Biden, even though, and this is really important too, even though one of the things that I noticed in this surprised me a little bit is that former President Donald Trump is also a large factor for voters. And this is where you're going to see, look, for Democrats, maybe the Democratic Party keeps talking about Donald Trump because that does motivate Democrats. And then for Republicans, this number really pops because they say Donald Trump is fighting for their issues even more than their own party in Congress.
Wow.
So to the extent that he is still leader of the Republican Party, he is still that motivating force. I think this starts to give you a preview of what the narrative of this campaign may end up.
And yet, Anthony, Republicans, according to the reporting that we've seen, are anxious that if Donald Trump announces that he's running for the presidency in 2024, some of these numbers, it would be interesting to see what happens if former President Trump were to announce that he's running for president in 2024, what the numbers would look like about who's motivated to go to the polls.
Yeah, and let's move from motivation then to vote. He's a net negative because if the people who say they're basing their vote a lot on Donald Trump break Democratic, in part because that's driven by Democrats who get motivated and don't like him, right? So to your point, if maybe the Republicans would like to pull over some of those Democratic voters based on these other issues, but those Democratic voters are hesitant because, well, wait a second, that's the Donald Trump party, right? That gives them a harder time. Gives them a harder time doing it.
Anthony Salvanto, always great to have you, my friend.
Always good having you.
Yeah.